branch of the Bible deals with history and doctrine. Song of Solomon is different. It's a love song, a story of love told in song, primarily allegorical, that however does not take away from its meaning, filled of course with metaphors, all meant to portray a loving relationship between a bridegroom and a bride, or Christ and His church, but again also with application to the individual child of God concerning their relationship with Jesus Christ. As you read through Song of Solomon, you see this man and this woman. They are in communion with one another. They continually express their love, their respect, their adoration, their appreciation for each other. And their lives are synchronized with each other. Again, primarily painting a picture of Christ and His church, but again, application to you and I. You don't hear a whole lot of preaching from Song of Solomon. I love to preach from Song of Solomon. Preached, I think, 3 times, series, through Song of Solomon. I've always wanted to, never gotten the liberty to preach on the principles of marriage, strictly from the book of Song of Solomon. But there's much here. And today we'd like to read chapter 5, verses 2 through 6. This is the bride, the Shulamite woman, speaking. She says, I sleep, but my heart waketh. Then what follows is what awoke her heart. It is the voice of my beloved that knocketh, saying, Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled. For my head is filled with dew, and my locks with the drops of the night. I have put off my coat. How shall I put it on? I have washed my feet. How shall I defile them? My beloved put his hand by the hole of the door, and my bowels or heart were moved for him. I rose up to open to my beloved. My hands dropped with myrrh, and my fingers with sweet-smelling myrrh upon the handles of the lock. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved hath withdrawn himself and was gone. My soul failed when he spake. I sought him, but I could not find him. I called him, but he gave me no answer. As you read Song of Solomon, the love of the Shulamite woman's life was Christ, was Him, this bridegroom. In chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, 4 times, once in verse 1, again verse 2, verse 3, and verse 4. 4 times she states, Him whom my soul loveth. 4 times. Him whom my soul loveth. She refers to him many times throughout the book as my beloved. He was the love of her life. Her love for him was certain. It was present tense. She said, my soul loveth. It's not, I think I love him. My soul loveth. It's a deep love. My soul. My soul. Doesn't get any deeper than that. My soul loveth. So it was a love that reached the inner depths of her being. Her love to him was public. Chapter 3, verse 3, she asked the watchman, saw ye whom my soul loveth? She wasn't ashamed. Chapter 5, verse 8, she said to the daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, tell him that I am sick of love, or tell him that I am lovesick because of his absence. So she was unashamed. She was uninhibited to declare her love for him to others. Her love for him had an impact upon her. Notice again, notice over in chapter 1, verse 13, verse 14. Notice the phrase, my well-beloved unto me. Unto me. Verse 14, my beloved is unto me. Made an impact upon her life. She says in chapter 2, verse 16, my beloved is mine, and I am his. Chapter 6, verse 3, she reverses the order. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. You see, there's a link between her and him. Chapter 1, verse 2, she says, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine. Verse 4, draw me, draw me. Verse 7, tell me, O thou whom my soul loveth. Again, there's a link. There's a bond between them. Her love for him caused her to have desires for him. We just saw that in those verses that we just read. When she thought of him, it brought her great joy. We see that in chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. She thought of him and it brought her great joy. Chapter 2, verse 4 and verse 6, she had personal experience of him. She says in verse 4, he brought me to the banqueting house. His banner over me was love. Verse 6, his left hand is under my head, and his right hand doth embrace me. She had personal experience of him. Chapter 5, verse 9, the daughters of Jerusalem asked her, what is thy beloved more than another? And she answered by giving a detailed description of him. She knew him. She knew him. But coming to our text, we wanted to establish this first. She loves him. There should be no doubt about that. She loves him. But coming to this text, coming to our text, this one who had such love for him finds herself in a state that caused her to neglect him. that caused her to be apathetic and indifferent toward him. Now, some in their ignorance will say, well, if you neglect, there's no love. Well, you neglect your loved ones. Not all the time, but there are times you do. You can neglect someone that you love. You can be apathetic toward them. You can be indifferent. She loved him. Yet she's in a state where she would neglect him, be indifferent toward him. And as a result, she misses an opportunity. And she also exposes herself to danger and great difficulty and loneliness. I believe our text serves as a warning to those who love the Lord. It's a warning for those who love the Lord. Our subject is spiritual drowsiness. Spiritual drowsiness. It's very common. Started to entitle it spiritual somnambulism, but it's too hard for me to say. What that means is sleepwalking. Spiritual sleepwalking. It's not very common, sleepwalking. 29% of children between the ages of 2 and 13 will experience an episode of sleepwalking. That's not very many. Only 4% of adults. So it's not very common, but it's epidemic amongst God's people. In fact, I would say most of God's people are sleepwalking most of the time. Most of the time. Just walking in their sleep. And it's something we all experience from time to time. It's a spiritual disorder. And it brings about the risk of injury. It brings about many dangers. But this woman, we want to establish, loved this man. There should be no doubt about that. But we want to observe her state, the condition that she found herself in. In verse 2, she confesses, I sleep, but my heart waketh. It's a state of semi-consciousness. Half asleep, half awake. Ever been there? Oh, we get there often physically. Half asleep, half awake. Not totally unconscious. Awake enough to give, not wake enough to give attention to the matters at hand. How many of God's people are not awake enough spiritually to handle the matters at hand? What is being described here is a state of spiritual fatigue, spiritual sluggishness. It's a lethargic state, a very drowsy state. And oh, how many of God's people are in that state? It is pictured, if you keep a mark there in Song of Solomon, and pictured in Revelation chapter 3, very familiar verse 15 and 16. I know thy works, that thou art neither cold nor hot. I would that thou wert cold or hot. So then, because thou art lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. Now this verse, 99.9% of the time, I believe, is misused, misinterpreted. They will say, hot is right with the Lord, cold is in a backslidden state, and the Lord would rather you be backslidden than halfway, than lukewarm. Do you really believe that? Do you, as you say those words, did you hear them? The Lord would rather you be backslidden than halfway between the two? Are you serious? That's not what that verse is teaching. Think about it this way. A hot drink is refreshing. In cold weather, a hot drink is refreshing. A cold drink is refreshing. Hot and cold are both refreshing. But you leave hot alone, you leave cold alone, and it becomes lukewarm. Lukewarm is not refreshing. Hot is refreshing. Cold is refreshing. But how does a hot or cold drink become lukewarm? Through neglect, through indifference. Concerning the Laodicean church here in Revelation 3, they through neglect, there was a lack of interest, a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of concern, a lack of zeal, a lack of response to spiritual matters. They were merely existing spiritually. Oh, there's a lot of people like that. They're half-hearted. They're spiritually numb. And the Lord said, lukewarm is unacceptable. It's nauseating to the Lord. I will spew thee out of my mouth. And oh, how many of God's people are in an unacceptable and nauseating state. Lukewarm. It simply means that they bring no refreshment whatsoever. The condition, verse 17, caused the problem with their perception. You see, they looked at themselves and nothing wrong with us. Oh, that is so descriptive of the Lord's churches today. So very descriptive of God's people today. Everything's all right with us. Nothing's wrong. They were self-centered. They were self-occupied. They were self-satisfied. They were self-sufficient. They were self-confident. They were filled with self-glorification. They were independent of the Lord. And they were arrogant. And they were vain, and they were worldly minded. It's just like those today, they say, Christ is our master. But they don't obey Him. And they'll say, Christ is the light. But they walk in darkness. And they'll say, Christ is the way. but they don't walk with Him. They'll say Christ is all wise, yet they don't follow Him. And they'll say Christ is the most lovely, but they have very little to do with Him. Christ is eternal, and yet they seek that which perishes. He's the King, yet they don't seek to honor Him. He's almighty, but they don't trust Him. It's just words. They're just existing spiritually. And I believe that is the condition that this woman is in here in Song of Solomon, chapter 5. Well, how did she get there? Same way anybody gets there. A failure to deal with sin will get you there every time. A disregard of spiritual things, a disregard of spiritual exercise, it'll get you there. The temporal having priority over the spiritual, you'll get in this state. She just falls into this condition. And many a child of God, like this woman in our text, they know what they ought to do, but they don't do it. How many times I've talked to people and say, I know. Well, do you? They know what to do, but they don't do it. When people say, you give them a spiritual truth, and they say, I know. What they're really saying is, I don't want to hear it. That's what they're really saying. They lack the power. They know what they ought to do, but the power to do it is not there. There is a part of them that wants to do it, but the power, the energy, is not there. They're spiritually drowsy. And they cannot, no matter how hard they try, they cannot arouse themselves from their spiritual stupor. And if they do, it's only for a brief amount of time. And then the drowsiness takes over. So there she is in this condition. And while she's in this spiritual condition, a spiritual opportunity comes to her. Regardless of your spiritual condition, spiritual opportunities are there. You may not be in a condition to take advantage of it, but the opportunity is there. Regardless of our spiritual condition, there are spiritual opportunities to be more, to do more, and to experience more spiritually. The woman in our text, though in love with the bridegroom, she's allowed herself to get into this state of semi-slumber. And how often we do the same. She lies upon her bed in this state. She has enough awareness about her to hear the voice of the bridegroom. And she has enough awareness about her to recognize that he is calling to her from outside the door. She has enough awareness to hear his knocking upon the door. She has enough awareness to realize that he's speaking in a tender way, and a pleading way. He says, open to me. Open to me. It is a picture of the Lord seeking fellowship with His blood-bought, redeemed people. He wants fellowship with us. That's amazing. He wants fellowship with us. That's what is pictured in Revelation 3:20. Revelation 3:20 is not a salvation invitation. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. That's for you and I that are saved. He wants fellowship with us. He that opens to me, I will sup with him. He wants fellowship with us. So there she is. She's lying upon her bed in a state of semi-slumber. And there he is. He's on the other side of the door, knocking. But he's also speaking. He says, open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled. He's not speaking in anger. He simply desires to be with her. Open to me. That's a call of love. It's a call to nearness. Open to me. It's a call for her to get up, to leave where she was. Open to me. It's a direct call. It's a call that demands spontaneous acceptance. So you see him there. He's knocking. He's speaking. He has come to where she is, desiring and seeking fellowship with her. How often the Lord comes to where we are, seeking and desiring fellowship with us. And we don't have time. He is seeking fellowship with her. She had experienced fellowship with him in the past. Read chapter 2. Again, he brought me to the banqueting house. And now she has another opportunity. What an opportunity is ours when he comes to where we are. Stands at the door and says, open to me. And addresses us in love, in tenderness, in patience. It was an opportunity for her at that moment to be together with him, to receive from him, and to give unto him. It was an opportunity for her at that moment to interact with him and to experience and enjoy him, and to be refreshed and invigorated by him. Open to me. What an opportunity. It is an invitation to fellowship with him. That's where we find assurance that only he can give. That's where we find the strength and the peace and the wisdom that only he can give. That is where spiritual desires are developed and fed and nourished. What grace, what mercy, that He desires and seeks fellowship with us. And that's what's happening here. He is seeking fellowship with her. Notice her response to the opportunity while in this condition. She's again conscious enough to hear. She can hear His knocking. She can hear His voice. She's alert enough. It's not just noise, it's not just sound, but she's alert enough to recognize His voice. She says in verse 2, "It is the voice of my beloved." She knew who was on the other side of that door. She knew who was speaking. It is the voice of my beloved. She's heard that voice before. Notice in chapter 2, verse 8. She says, "The voice of my beloved." And in verse 10 of that same chapter, "My beloved spake." So she's heard that voice before. And she knows that voice. And she loves Him. She has no desire to be unkind toward Him. She has no desire to mistreat Him. She loves Him. But in her condition, at this moment, she's more concerned with the satisfaction of her fleshly needs than Him. She's in bed. He's knocking. He's pleading. He's desiring closer fellowship with her. She has a wonderful opportunity of blessing, but she's in a state of semi-slumber. She's spiritually drowsy. And she's willing for Him to wait. We can do this another time. She's willing to put Him off. Don't tell me you've never been willing to put off the Lord. We've all done that. That's a terrible state to be in. Does it mean that we don't love Him? No, not necessarily. But it means we're in a terrible state. We've said many times, the Lord must be first, never next. He is never to be next. He's always to be first. If He's next, then you're willing to put Him off. And that's a terrible state to be in. But she was willing. She didn't say, "Go away!" But she was willing to put Him off. And the result? She didn't open the door. There was no door of welcome to Him. Have we ever not welcomed the Lord into our life? Oh, many times. Many times. When we hesitate, that's not very welcoming. She's willing to put Him off. We need to ask ourselves, how welcoming are we toward Christ? How welcoming are we toward Christ? Now, if I come to your house at 3 o'clock in the morning, knock on your door, more than likely you're not going to say, oh, come on in, Brother Dan. It's a bad time. That's never so with the Lord. Never so. But yet, how often are we unwelcoming? How ready are we to receive Him into our lives? Well, she wasn't very ready at that moment. Have you ever been not ready to receive Him into your life? Oh, many times. Many, many times. Perhaps you're not honest enough to admit it, but it's the truth. She, in verse 3, and this is what we do, she began to make excuses. And you know what? Her excuses made sense to her. Anytime you can put off the Lord and it makes sense to you, you're in a bad place. You're in a sad, sad state of mind. She began to make excuses, and it made sense. How many times we've talked to people, it could be church attendants. Oh, and they come up with a list that's a mile long. And the sad thing isn't so much their list. The sad thing is that list makes sense to them. That's what's sad. It makes sense. It's all ridiculous, but it makes sense. Again, beware of when it makes sense to put off the Lord. Here's what she says. I put off my coat. Well, put it back on. I put off my coat. How shall I put it on? Same way you took it off, but reverse. I have washed my feet. Keep in mind they had dirt floors. Shall I defile them? I've already washed my feet. If I get up, they're going to get dirty again. Well, guess what? When you get up in the morning, what's going to happen? They're going to get dirty. And what will you do? You'll wash them again. But you see, it makes sense to her. I can't put my coat back on. And I can't wash my feet again. It's as if the Lord was making unreasonable demands to her. And we do that. So here's what she's saying. She's saying, I've already gotten undressed. I've gotten ready for bed. I have washed my feet. And if I get up and walk to the door, my feet are going to get dirty. And I'll have to wash them again. It was too much of an inconvenience. How often that happens. You see, she had gotten comfortable. God's people get mighty comfortable. I'll be honest with you, I don't know of a time when God's people have been more comfortable than they are today. You get awfully comfortable. And when people get comfortable, they don't like their comfort zone disturbed. She's gotten careless. And takes him and the opportunity that is before her for granted. She takes it for granted. She lingers in her sleepiness, hearing his voice as he continually calls. Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled. But she's saying, not now. Not now. Wait till some other time. How many people do that? People do it all the time. You tell somebody about their spiritual responsibility, well, Brother Dan, you need to understand, later I might be able to do that. That's what she's saying. That's a terrible place to be, and especially when you can justify it in your own mind. So she's saying, not now. I would. Open to me. I would. But I've washed my feet. I would, but I've put off my coat. You say, well, that's ridiculous. Yes, it is. And we do the same thing. The Lord invites Himself into our lives. And we say, and it makes sense to us, Lord, I would, but. What a sad, sad state to be in. She heard His voice. She heard what He said. Oh, this happens almost every church service. God's people hear His voice. They know what they ought to do. Well, I'll wait till I get home. Yeah, and how does that work? It doesn't. It's just putting off the Lord. It's just putting the Lord off. We're good at that. And we're good at making excuses why we do it. So she heard what He said. She heard Him knock. She knew who it was at the door. And she also saw. It says, verse 4, my beloved put his hand by the hole of the door. She could see him. And my bowels or my heart was moved. She's aware enough to, it caused some stirring in her heart. It wasn't that she had no feeling toward Him. She loves Him. But she doesn't want to be inconvenienced. Like many of God's people. It's not that they don't love Him at all. It's not that they don't desire Him to be near. But it's just not the right time. You mean to tell me that there is a time when it's right for us to put off the Lord? There is no such time. Well, it's just not the time. Not now. Not now. I had people say to me many times, Brother Dan, I'd be glad to talk to you, but not now. Oh, really? Well, when is now going to be? I know, you know. Never. Never. Just not time. Never is. You see, it's not that she didn't love Him. It's not that she didn't want Him to be close to her. It's not that she had no interest in Him whatsoever. But she'll set the terms. We're the same way. Not honest enough to admit it, but we're the same way. I'll set the terms. She's had her bath. She's put on her night clothes. And she doesn't want to be bothered about other things until her own time. Until her own time. He's calling. He's knocking. And to her, it's no big deal to keep Him on the outside. When that's no big deal, you're in a lot of trouble. It's no big deal to put him off until I'm ready. That's her thought process. This is the very reason many of God's people who ought to be serving, submitting, worshiping, thanking, and praising the one who saved their soul are cold and powerless because they put Christ off every day. Every day. And they treat him like a fire escape. He's just a little doll you put up on the shelf. Put him up on the shelf until I need you. And when I need you, I'll let you know. Until then, you stay out of my life. And God's people would say, oh, I'm appalled. Look in the mirror. Look in the mirror. We do it all the time. We do it all the time. From all of this, a spiritual opportunity was lost. In her own good time, she decided that she would get up. Got to get my feet dirty. Got to put my coat on. I got to get my feet dirty. She got up. But to her grief and dismay, verse 6, I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had withdrawn himself. And this is where many of God's people get mad at God. Oh, I opened and he wasn't there. Now, how long did you put him off? When she threw open the door, he was gone. And as she looked out, she couldn't see him anywhere. We read in verse 6, I sought him, but I could not find him. I called. He called her too. He gave me no answer. So she rushes out into the streets, calls his name. I'm ready for you now. But there's no answer. That opportunity's lost. He's gone. Not forever. But that particular opportunity is gone. You realize how many we don't? We waste that are gone? She's grief-stricken. She ought to be. Not so much that he's gone. She ought to be grief-stricken because of what she's done. She didn't open to him. You see, there's a lesson there also. We get grief-stricken, but most of the time we're grief-stricken over the wrong thing. She's grief-stricken over the consequences rather than what caused the consequences. I believe she's almost frantic at this point. The lesson is, you can't just put off the Lord and ignore His will until you're ready. And expect Him to jump at your bidding. But God's people do that all the time. How many of God's people push Christ, push His purposes to the side? Now's not the time. They ignore His will. They belittle His cause. While they are wrapped up in themselves, wrapped up in the secular interest of life, they are awake but asleep. This condition brought some difficulties into her life. Verse 7. The watchmen that went about the city found me. They smote me. Oh, those wicked watchmen! It wouldn't have happened had she opened the door and let them in. She wouldn't have had to be outside. Now she has put herself in a place where she's going to suffer, where she's going to have trouble. God's people do that all the time also. They put themselves, because of their mistreatment of the Lord, they put themselves in a very bad place and then get mad at others. Well, you're mad at the wrong person. You need to be mad at yourself. If I'd opened the door, let him in, enjoyed a sweet time, I wouldn't have to be out here. But because of the way I treated him, because of my response to his call, I felt the need to go out in the streets. You say, well, she's doing a good thing. She's seeking him. Yes, but she didn't have to do it out there. He was seeking her. All she had to do was open the door. Oh, how guilty we are. She goes into the city. She's in search of him. And there she meets with trouble. Didn't have to, but she's put herself in that position. Had she responded to his knocking and speaking, she didn't even need to go outside. Be aware of an unhealthy spiritual condition, the condition of semi-slumber, can expose you to dangers you would have not otherwise ever encountered. So many times when we face troubles, we do need to ask ourselves, well, why? And it may not be any fault of yours, but probably most of the time it is. How many troubles and difficulties and sorrows could be avoided if we just obeyed when he called? If we just followed his instructions instead of making excuses and trying to set our own terms, waiting for a more convenient time. She is an example of what to do if you find yourself in this condition. She goes out into the street, seeking and calling him. She was abused by the watchmen. It says that they took her veil and they wounded her. But now she becomes a good example. She continues to seek him. She continues to call for him. If you have put off the Lord speaking to you, and you find yourself now in an unpleasant condition, you need to keep seeking him. She could not be deterred. She's going to find him. Don't be deterred from seeking him. At this point, she's willing. Before, she wasn't willing to take off her coat or put her coat back on. She wasn't willing to put her shoes back on. But now, she's willing to endure anything to be reunited to her beloved. That needs to be us. But most people, that's not what they do. They sit around and blame everybody else for their miserable life. Keep seeking him. Keep seeking him. She had been indifferent to him before, But now she says in verse 8, I am sick of love. And that doesn't mean the way it sounds. It means I'm lovesick. I'm lovesick. My love for him has made me sick because of what I've done. She now aches to be near him, to be in his arms. She wants nothing more than to be reunited with him. Before, she was too comfortable, too indifferent to get out of the bed and open the door. Now she has a heart entirely for him, and she's seeking him. She becomes an example to us now. We need to make personal examination. Where does this passage of Scripture find our heart? Where are we? A heart entirely for him? I don't think there's anyone here who has a heart entirely against God. We all have a love for the Lord. But we need to make examination. Is our heart entirely for him? Or are we in a state of semi-slumber? A semi-conscious state. Can hear his voice. And I know it's him. And I can hear his direction or his instruction open to me. He's knocking. But yet you put him off for a more convenient time. Where is our heart in this matter? Here's something else in closing that God's people do. They find themselves in a state of semi-slumber, spiritually. So they begin to make excuses. Someone may try to encourage them to wake up. But most of the time, here's what they do. Well, I'll find someone else that's just in the same state I am. We'll form our own party. And you begin to hang around with people who are walking in their sleep. Then you know what happens? That's the norm. Nothing wrong with me. Everybody else, same way. That's where we are today. Spiritually drowsy people, seeking out spiritually drowsy people, walking in their sleep and say, well, this is normal. Just like the man who was lame for 38 years. As he sat around that pool with all the crippled folks, guess what? Being crippled became normal. That's what happens. We seek people out like us. We usually don't seek people out that are different than us. And that's true in almost every realm. Almost every realm. Could be in almost any realm. We seek people like us. And that's how it is spiritually. Well, I'm not right with God. This person isn't real close to the Lord. Because a person who's not right with God does not want to hang around with somebody who is. So they seek out. People say, it's amazing how these people congregate. No, it's not. It happens all the time. We do it in every realm. It's a terrible place to be. You're spiritually not right. And that's normal. How sad. How sad. God help us. We love the Lord, but we've all been guilty of putting Him off. And I dare say that every single one of us, every single day, put Him off in some way. We can't ever be satisfied with that spiritual condition. It exposes us to all kinds of dangers. And it exposes us to other spiritual disorders as well. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in a verse of song.